Okay, well, I can start with introducing the actual day. Hello everyone, and welcome to the first webinar of this season on the data-centric engineering webinar series. If you're not already aware, data-centric engineering is an open access journal which is published by Cambridge University Press. And we're delighted today to be bringing you this webinar series, and thanks to our editors and the support of Lloyd's Redlicher Foundation and also the Alan Turing Institute. So today, we're very pleased to have Professor Markus Kraft, who will be presenting his talk titled Augmenting Reality with the World Avatar, Automating Data-Centric Engineering. If this sounds daunting, it's because I think it is. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items just so that we know how to participate in today's event and a few housekeeping things. So you've all joined in a listen-only mode, which means you'll be able to hear us, but unfortunately you'll not be able to speak to us. However, you will have the opportunity to submit any questions you have in the chat. So there's a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. So if you press that, and when we get into the Q&A session, then I'll read those out and we'll go through those. In fact, you can send them in at any time during the webinar, and then I'll just collect them at the end. If we're unable to get through all the questions, they will be included in the document that we're going to send out at the end of the webinar. We'll try our best to get through all of them, but it might not be the case. Should you experience any technical difficulties, please also add this to the questions box, and a member of the team will sort that out for you. In the unlikely event that we experience any issues, we will message the audience and restart the webinar. But I don't think that will happen. So to summarize, submit your questions at any time, submit any technical problems at any time. We'll go through all the questions at the end, and we'll sort technical problems as soon as they come up. Okay, and I'd also like to encourage all of you to follow us on Twitter and on LinkedIn, because that's where we're going to post all the new seminar series that come out, as well as calls for papers and things like that, all to do with the journal. It's a great way to just keep up to date with what's going on. And if you're ever talking about things with the journal, sharing your papers in here or sharing your experience seeing one of the seminars, please use the hashtag DCE webinars to share your thoughts and also start any meaningful conversations. Okay, so today, as I said before, we have Professor Markus Kraft. Now, Markus Kraft is many accolades, and I'll list the current ones, which is Professor of Chemical Engineering at Cambridge. He's the head of the computational modeling group over there. He's also director of CARES, which is a Singapore-Cambridge research center, which is where he's currently actually right now. So he's giving us a talk from late in the evening. So very grateful to him for that. And he's also recently been elected a fellow at the Alan Turing Institute. So in the earlier stages of his career, he made significant contributions towards carbon abatement and emissions reductions with his research. And then recently he's focused on cyber-physical systems, but he keeps that key motivation, which is to reduce energy consumption and reduce those harmful emissions. Now, enough of me introducing him. I'll let Markus Kraft introduce himself. So over to you, Professor.
Thank you very much. I guess this is where I now share my screen. Let me see how to do that. Okay. This. Okay. Could you just let me know whether you see my screen? I now can't. Okay, good, great. Okay, well, then, okay. First of all, thank you very much for introducing me, and hello from Singapore to everyone. As you said in your introduction, I am wearing many hats, although you can't see them. But my main employer is the University of Cambridge, and as such, I'm running the COMO group in the Department of Chemical Engineering in Cambridge. And for the last 10 years, I'm actually based in Singapore. And here I build up and direct I'm the scientific director of CARES, as a research lab in Singapore. But I'm also an entrepreneur. So I have co-founded the company called Computational Modeling Cambridge Limited, so that's CMCL. And last year, we founded a daughter company in Germany, in my hometown. This was a direct result of COVID, computational modeling PyRMSens. You will hear more about it. So this is all about augmenting reality with the world avatar. So let me explain why that is. Okay. So in the first instance, I'd like to start with a problem. And one of the problems we see is if you want to solve the big problems, then you very quickly understand that everything is connected. And we want to make use of digital, the digital environment and infrastructure to improve models, to make decisions and so on. But then you discover very quickly that you have different protocols, the data is ambiguous, there's a high friction exchange and integration, and you also get lock-in effects and searching switching costs, right? So here, this is sort of software that can't talk to one another. Here, these are different data sources from completely different fields. So we distinguish between the physical realm, these are stuff you can touch, and the cyber realm. This doesn't necessarily have to be a cloud, but of course in the cloud too. And into this, we get a lot of data from some sort of sensors. Right, so how do we want to solve this and overcome this? So I say, okay, that ontology can be used and to express conceptual models of particular domains. We're using ontologies to represent data in a logical knowledge graph. That means it doesn't have to be necessarily a triple store or something, but it has to look logically as a knowledge graph. We have to be software and hardware agnostic. Okay, so we use that using semantic web technology and containering. And we want the whole thing to be dynamic. So we want to have an automated cascading of new information to the entire knowledge graph based on dependencies. So what does that mean? So for example, imagine this is some sort of data sources that influences the market value of a property. Okay. And then, okay, you then have some sort of flood, and that has some sort of impact on the property backwards. And ideally, this changes, this process, which changes in time, is well represented in what I call the world avatar. So world avatar is basically a project name. It's not a piece of software. It's mainly an idea. You may say architecture. It's a collection of many softwares and data pieces and ontologies. Most of it is in the public domain. I mean, the ontology T boxes are in the public domain. All the software that we've been using in the public domain. And if you are interested to also work in this with this framework and with this idea, you can access the web page, and that will tell you how to do this. So key point here is it's a unified and seamless user interface, efficient automation of processes, and interoperable static and dynamic data. So the idea is it connects, so it does what we've before said is a problem. It connects data silos and use this knowledge graphs to unlock the power of your organization's data in a sense. So it's not just the organization, but also across the organization, could be a whole country. And we can use it to control, because now we have live data in it. Okay, we can use it to query, and I will say something about this later. And we can have alternative worlds within that knowledge graph that basically means you can use it for scenario studies. So this value proposition, how does it look like? Okay, to give you an idea, I'll show more later. So it's platform agnostic, it's cross-domain and interoperable and role-based data access. So what you see here is, for example, a website that can show 3D geometries. Here we use a cesium representation. That's what you see here. But we can also use other representations as a website. They are more two-dimensional for GIS systems. Here, the data that you see comes from a facility management sensor or system and a building information model. And we also provide access through mobile phones, and currently we're also working on VR glass access. So it can automate processes because the knowledge graph as such in the World Avatar is not static, it's dynamic, okay? So what we've used here, this, and I will discuss this a little later in more detail, we have connected two robots, one in Singapore, one in Cambridge, to work on one and the same problem. But we can also create the knowledge base of molecules. And what we've done here is we basically semantically represented molecule fragments and used these fragments to propose new molecules. These are cage molecules. They're called metal organic polyhedrals. And because we keep that sort of from scratch, with a number of what we call assembly models, we are able to produce more than 1,400 new molecules that so far weren't existed in the human knowledge space. And then finally, we can make static and dynamic data interoperable. And now I move into a different application. So this is flight risk management. I will discuss this in more detail in a few minutes. And here we can integrate geographic information system data, the network infrastructure, water and power, and telecom actually, property values and population, flood levels, time series, and infrastructure. We can also go into energy management. What you see here is a household in Pirmasens. It's my hometown. So now you see this BIM symbol, that is building information model. It's a very rich representation, commercial representation of architectural constructions. We have time series, and we can have live weather data, and we know the infrastructure around the building that helps us to understand how to improve the energy management. And now here is a little BIM model of that home that we've been looking at. And finally, we can use the same BIM model also to represent our laboratory in Singapore. This is exactly what you see here. And you also see live data from our building management system. Here you see BMS. So this is a Schneider BMS system. I will explain this a little later. And finally, we have basically a general representation of data, time series data. This is called Graphene. And if you want to, now let me do something that one should never do. We should test something. You know, this is now the system live in Singapore. Let's see whether it shows. Okay, so here you basically can investigate what happens in our laboratory. You see there are many different aspects. So we have different fume hoods, and so there is lots of data, live data, that are in the knowledge graph and can then be looked at through this. And it's quite interesting is that you may see here, these are red bars, okay? And the blue curve is supposed to not be in that red bar, and whenever it goes into that red bar, then our lab manager would be informed. Okay, so just to give you an idea what this looks like. And now I want to go into a bit more detail. for two use cases. So one was the extreme weather events, as I've already mentioned. This was a project that started with UK funding called Credo and was then continued. And then later I will talk about lab automation. So what's the problem? Okay, now you'd say, flooding is not so much of a problem, but as it turns out, there is more than 2.5 million properties that are at risk of being flooded. And more recently, the risk for severe floods has significantly increased. And as a consequence, you will see that the number of river measuring sites available to help identify flood risks has increased over the last few years because the economic impact of this has risen considerably. So what we want to do is now we use the word avatar for automated flood impact assessment. So we assess the potential impact of flooding with regard to people and buildings and ensure that these up-to-date insights evolve in time. So what you see here is a snapshot. The brown region here is the flooded region. And then you can see, okay, there is 329.64 million property affected, okay, 920 people, 920 building and 3,475 people. And now a different warning, okay, it looks very similar, but you can see the color difference. And suddenly, okay, the property value at risk has increased. Okay, and this is partly because the property prices have changed and then the system updates the impact automatically. So how do we do this? You know, we had to do ontology development, here flood events and warnings, environmental observations, building environment. And for that, we are reusing mainly existing ontologies, use a modularized approach, top level and domain ontology. So this is a classical example, top level ontology, and then quantity is then the water level, and that has a range and a trend and so on. Okay, and on top of the underlying world avatar, this is this region here. We have agents that act on it to keep it dynamic, and we have input agents that get data from, say, the Met Office, the Environmental Agency, the HI Land Registry, and the Ordnance Survey for the house prices and stuff. And in a bit more detail, you see the wealth of data that goes into this. We also have UK Air Observation Service, Environmental Agency information, and so on. And so these are the different ontology areas. So this is the environment, this is flood risk, this is built environment, and this is OntoCity GML, is a specific method to represent the geometry of the buildings. And so in order to estimate the flood risk, we query the flood alerts and warnings, okay, and this is this flood assessment agent. And for it to work, it will go into the built environment and check this value, but it may then find, okay, this is outdated, then it triggers to other agents, so the property value estimation agent and the average square meter price agent. And once these agents have updated this entity, the flood assessment agent has the new value and would then feed that back into the instance accordingly. So we call this the derivation framework, and it's central to the world avatar construction, and also that makes it different to a standard knowledge graph. We represent these dependencies in the knowledge graph, and you can see this here, the blue box. So we have consistent provenance information, and to have autonomous cascading of new information through the entire knowledge graph. So updates are triggered when new information instantiated. So that means the word avatar remains on time. Okay, and you can sort of see this, how this information then travels through the overall knowledge graph as I described earlier. Now, to give you an idea of the complexity and the wealth of information, I will show you a few examples. So we use this single interface. So in this case, we use Mapbox, which is part of our World Avatar visualization framework. And so this can be modified to a specific user for specific access rights. So this would then contain weather, water, rainfall, air quality, and combines the live sensor with some static information. So here, for example, you see the sensors. So here's a water station, and then here you have air quality, and then, sorry, this is not water station. So this is actually weather, air quality, and here are the water sensors. And these water sensors, they have sort of lifetime series associated with it. And say, here is an example of time series for the air quality. And now let's look at one of these sensors. Sorry, I have to apologize, it's a bit small, but you can see how the water level rises over time, yeah, and at that sensor, and then there's a little stream, you can't really see it, going down this direction, and there's a downstream water sensor that then would then also observe this water rise, but of course, there may be other sources that make this rise steeper and the water level higher, okay? And what you can do then when you have this connected avatar concept, you can instantiate water, power, and mobile phone infrastructure. So this is actually the water infrastructure that makes sure that water comes out of your tap at home. And of course, in order to ensure that water comes out of your tap, you need to have a certain pressure in the water distribution system. This pressure is provided by pumps, and these pumps are basically run by electric power. So they are connected to the power network, and there's also the mobile phone network, which of course, in a case of emergency, is very important because you want to be able to contact the people who are affected by this. And of course, the mobile phones itself, they have a battery, but the broadcasting stations don't. They are directly to the power network. So if you want to really assess the damage of a flood, you have to know how these networks are connected. In practice, that means that in practice, the power company, they have already very, very good ways of controlling their network, but they have no idea about the power network. They only know whether their pumps have power or not. The power network doesn't know what pumps or what consumers are connected to the power network. They only know there is a consumer, and the mobile phone networks same. Okay, so imagine now looking at the substation, and this is what you see here. Then say you observe. Okay, this is sort of the instance of the substation. You observe, okay, it lost its power, okay, but you also see it's not flooded. But of course, now you know this substation is connected to primary stations, okay, primary substations, and then you can look, okay, the primary substations, they are flooded, and therefore this is not working. So this is sort of a backward analysis, but at the same time, if I know that this substation is down, I know these two water pumps and this phone mast is also not working. And through that, we have sort of failures cascading in the whole infrastructure, and we're well aware where the problem lies and where how to mitigate it. And I will get back to this in a second. So how to mitigate it? So that requires context-aware routing. So if you go from A to B, you can use Google Maps and then it shows you. But what if there is a flood? And what you see here in blue, these are actual flood data, historical flood data. And now you want to do the routing using this information. And within our system, you then can check, this route doesn't work. So you have to obviously work out an alternative. Okay, so based on location of people in distress, you have to define what's the fastest route, how is the minimum time to rescue them, and assign the right vehicle. So now here in this case, if you want to rescue somebody who is here, then it turns out that a normal ambulance is not good enough for that. So you have to take a fire truck in order to get to this point. Or if you want to go more directly, you would have to amphibious vehicle. And this, of course, this ability can then be used for disaster planning. And what you see here is a hospital. This is Queen Elizabeth Hospital, and it shows the reachable population under normal conditions. And these are isochrones. These are sort of areas. If you live in this area, it takes you 2 minutes to get to the hospital and 4 minutes and so on. Okay, and then you can check how does this change in case of a flood. And this is what's indicated here. And you can then identify how many people are actually affected by this. And in top of that, you can then look at specific flood scenarios and identify the critical infrastructure. And here we are looking at 2 bridges, right? And so we can do some sort of sensitivity analysis and weight how important a bridge is. And this is what we have done here. So you can also look into post-disaster recovery. So now, before repairing, it takes 6 minutes travel time to go from A to B. And after repairing critical infrastructure, we can then shorten the recovery time. So, and that sort of closes the first sort of regional city-based aspect of the world avatar. And all of these things, Pirmasens, King's Lynn, and all the use cases I will show in future, which is mainly in the lab, are all in one system. So they're all sort of, you can talk through federated query call, reach any link. I mean, it's not, this is at least the aim. We are still working on this technically. This is a research effort, and there will be a own talk by itself. But the idea is that we construct the world avatar such it has just one single entry point and everything is connected. Okay. Now the next point where I want to show the power of the system is in the area of lab automation. One reason why we chose lab automation is in CARES in Singapore, we do have a lab. That means we have access to all the data, which is always a problem. I'm sure many of you know this problem. And we looked at our lab, and then you will then find that there are many fragmented platforms in which the information is presented, and I've just named a few. So there's laboratory information management system, there's execution system, there are electronic notebooks, there's the building information model, there are building management systems, simulation tools, IoT dashboards, and so on. So data and software tools are complex. So what I now want to do is I want to then explain how we look at humans in the presence of the world avatar. So the idea is that so far the human in the loop So this, imagine this is you, and then you say, oh yeah, actually I'm hungry. I would like to bake my favorite cake. Okay. And then, because you've done it many times before, you just go and imagine this is your kitchen machine and your oven, and then you go and just bake a cake, right? But now this is you. Now imagine for a moment, world avatar exists completely, fully, and now this is not you again. That this is me. Okay, so but I have the same thought. Okay, I also want to bake a cake, but unfortunately, I do not know how. Okay, so and this is when the world avatar comes in. The world avatar represents knowledge base, knowledge and data, state of the world. And the world avatar knows how to do it, thank God, okay? And then uses either me, so that would be me, okay, and the kitchen mixer and the oven to build the cake. And the world avatar tells me how to do it, okay, maybe through an app or some other means. Now, in effect, this already exists to some extent, because I'm sure many of you may have downloaded Google recipes or Google recipes, or you watch YouTube videos to learn the how, okay? But the idea is that in the context of the world avatar, this how is formally represented and can not only talk to humans through natural language, but also through semantic algorithms and knowledge and agents to these robots. And this is possible because we have the derivation of sub-goals. That means this is the knowledge, you break it down. I want to bake a cake. What do I need to do? I need to have flour and eggs and so on. So, so this is sort of sub-goal derivation from a knowledge model. And we have to have the derived information framework, and that's what I've explained earlier in detail. That tells you, that gives you a constant updated representation of the world in the realm of the world avatar. So what we've done then for the lab context, we basically say, okay, there's a handler, there's a mobile unit or a human. We have the building, laboratory, infrastructure, and we have the actual science experiment. And that sort of leaves us with overlapping areas. So there is a research facility manager, the research lab manager, and the research scientist. And so in the world avatar, we created the digital researcher, lab manager, and facility manager. And in order to be able to do this, we of course need a lot of ontologies. And here is just a snapshot to show how many ontologies come in. And that goes from quantum chemistry to devices like mass spectrometers, GCs, et al., to the bench equipment, to the building itself, and the context in which the building is. So here we have specific use cases for the research facility manager. We have a billing management system, Query app, and in fact, what I showed you earlier, the dashboard solution, that was actually live data from our laboratory, and our billing manager is actually using this. And then we have the research lab manager, and here we have sort of an asset app. So we handle all our assets in the lab through the world avatar. And we have a chemical robot, and in fact, it's one in Cambridge and one in Singapore, and I'll explain this in a second. So here is the fume hood, here is the lab manager, it's your laboratory fume hood. So fume hood requests data, okay, the sash sends sash opening data, that's what we've seen earlier. Then the fume hood agent requests the data. This is then updated in the knowledge graph. Then there's a human query agent that checks it. It initiates an email and crafts and sends automatic email to the lab manager, and the lab manager goes and closes the fume hood. Okay. So this is just an example. Nowadays, there are many systems that do that on the so-called edge side, but at least you get the picture, and in fact we have instantiated this. Then, of course, you can go to the digital scientist, and what you see here are a few examples. I will talk about, these are combustion examples up here. Then here we have an agent that finds potential energy surfaces. I talked already about the metal polyhedral metal organic polyhedrals. These are these cage molecules, and I will talk about some querying tools a little later. And here are the connected robots setups. This is the one in Singapore, this is the one in Cambridge, and these two work together in order to find the right composition, the right concentration of catalyst and concentration of the reactants in order to achieve a maximum yield and a minimum cost. So that requires the goal derivation framework. So we have a goal, then a goal iteration is basically working through an algorithm, and that gives us a result, and we evaluate it, and then move back and forth in this area. And that ends up with a Pareto front. So here you have the cost of the algorithm, of the experiment. This is the yield, and you end up, the yellow dots are the experiments in Singapore, and the blue dots are the experiments in Cambridge. And you then can identify what's called a Pareto front. This is basically a set of non-dominated solutions being chosen as optimal if no objective can be improved without sacrificing at least one other objective. Okay? So that's actually been very successful. It's just been it's under review in Nature Comms. And then also to have something in Building Manager, I was talking about tracking explosive precursors. So here, no, actually, I haven't tracked it. I only talked about asset management, but here we have this is not an asset management system. We use here RFID tracking, and basically explosive precursor, if they removed out of the cupboard, then and not turned back, then that would trigger an email which goes then to the lab manager's mobile phone. And then I guess I cannot really talk in the data-centered engineering without actually mentioning some machine learning. So of course, for us, machine learning is also part of the whole world avatar, and there are many agents, and we try to benefit from these enormous advantages that we've seen in the last few years. So one of the key points where you can use it is question answering systems. And what I want to show here is Marie. We've been for the last few years constantly trying to develop such question answering systems. Of course, I have to say the emergence of GPT has changed the landscape enormously. So at the moment, in the world avatar, questions are normally answered using something that's called Sparkle queries. For that, you need a Sparkle endpoint, goes to world avatar. They're underlying. At the moment, we do this for the chemistry domain. There are a number of underlying ontologies, and from those we can get information, and the user gets a result like these lists. Okay, but wouldn't it be much better to be able to have a natural language query and this whole thing work automatically? And yeah, okay, you just asked the question, do you know the log P of, I spare trying to pronounce this, a specific acid, it's basically water solubility, then you get a machine translation, and here you get a Sparkle query, and then you execute it and give some answer. So, and this step here, this is something we have investigated, and we've used pre-trained large language models. In this case, we didn't use GPT. We wanted to be, we only use software that are in the public domain, although in principle we can use commercial software and wrap this into our agent systems. But in this case, we chose public domain. We looked at a number of large language models, and people who are familiar with large language models may have seen plenty 5 in different sizes. And we basically trained these language models in order to translate the natural language queries into Sparkle queries. And there's a pipeline with which it happens. Okay, you have a training set, test set, then yes, the large language models that will be then fine-tuned. And once you have the fine-tuned question, you can do some pre-processing and then get out the Sparkle query. That in turn queries the knowledge graph, and that gives you the answer. This is a snapshot. Okay, list of species are classified as alcohol with the boiling point 120 centigrade, and then you get this list. Of course, we compared it to GPT, and I mean, like I have to say, the highest appreciation for GPT, but of course, the wealth of information and the accuracy that we can provide cannot be provided with GPT. Finally, I want to close this talk with a few screenshots of my hometown in Pirmasens. I need to advertise a little bit because I like it very much. What you see here are isochrones, and the different colors of the building represent different usages. And you can then see, we can go from this GIS level down to the building information model. We have software called City Energy Analyst that allows us to calculate the energy consumption or estimate the energy consumption of each of these buildings depending on use. We can then, of course, look at sceneries like put solar cells on it, and because we have some data about sunshine, we can basically calculate live data of these solar cells, and we can then do detailed energy models across the whole of the city. And with this, I would like to conclude. I hope you enjoyed the talk. I showed you a number of use cases. I told you something about context-aware agents for these use cases, and hopefully convinced that this world avatar can evolve in time through some cascading process, and is a very, I would say, powerful approach to try to mitigate interoperability problems. And with that, I would like to close and invite any questions.
Great. Yep. Thank you very much, Markus, Professor Kraft. So, like you just said, open up for any questions. Please put them either in the chat or in the Q&A, and I will go through any that you post in there. Maybe whilst we wait for some to come in, I certainly have 1 or 2 questions, if that's okay, Professor Kraft.
Yeah.
So my first one was actually on a couple of things to do with the ontology. Was there any interestingly shared characteristics between ontologies of different systems, and how does that make them how can you implement that, or is it just important to keep the characteristics different between the systems? Because obviously when you have the interactions, you say you can pass on information via the characteristics of one, but are there any shared characteristics between different systems?
Ontologies varies. Ontology varies a lot depending where they come from, especially specific domain ontologies can be very different. They can be either super shallow, like sort of what you get out of Wikidata or something, or they can be super deep, especially if the ontology has been developed by sort of domain experts. You normally get something that is so deep and so detailed that you then end up with problems, because performance problems, for example. So what we do is we also develop our ontologies by hand. It's not an automated process, and we just try to look at what is there and then just add what is needed for our purpose. This is, of course, not a satisfying process, but for now it will do. I completely, for me, these ontologies itself are not static. I think this is why I don't want to devote too much time changing them. One of the key research areas in future is how to automate. So imagine you have a large body of T-boxes, they're all connected. Then, of course, the idea is to then automatically create agents that work on the T-box space. And this is why at the moment I don't really care, and just do what's needed to get the work done. And later it's clear we have to have a proper cleanup, but this is not a cleanup by hand. This must be an automated process, in my view.
Mm-hmm. No, that makes sense. Thank you very much. Okay, we have a question from Britta Kleinsorger. She asks, who so far has shown the main interest in the world avatar? Is it mainly academia, government/local governments, utility companies, and which sector do you think would benefit most from the world avatar?
Good question. I mean, like, I can tell you who my collaborators were so far in this Credo project. These were actually large utility companies. Anglian Water was involved, and the power network, as well as the grid operator. But in Singapore, I'm part of a consortium that's called PIPS, and that has pharmaceutical companies. So they are very interested in the lab automation, right? In the whole process of lab automation. And in my hometown, this is in Pirmasens, there I work with what's called Stadtwerke. It's a utility provider in Germany, specific system, and also with the Stadt itself, the city. Now in Germany, just like in the UK, there is a plan to decarbonize their operation, and that has something to do with heating and energy provision. And so the German government just passed a law that requires each city in Germany to come up with a strategy on how to do this. And this strategy requires to have a system that allows for the effect of interoperability. So, for example, if you have to decide whether you want to have a distributed district heating system, you then need to know where are the houses, what are the rules, how can you, what does that mean for the electricity network, if you have heat pumps and so on. And that in turn is connected to the energy prices. If you have a heat pump, you have to pay so much more than if you have your gas boiler. And all these things are basically interconnected. And for those, we have developed, basically, it was one of the initial motivations to develop this world avatar. And of course, now this legal requirement, it's called in German Wärmeplanung, is there is a need for this. And in fact, now you just told me earlier, you're sitting at ETH, the city energy analyst that was developed in Zurich, in your fine institution, okay? They also have a laboratory in Singapore with whom we talk to city planners, and this is another city application where you basically have to decide, okay, say you want to have a hairdresser shop and you need to choose where to put it, or you want to build a certain building. That depends on what is built, on the built environment, and it depends, of course, on the rule system. And within the word avatar, we could develop an application that were suitable for City Cloud.
Great, thank you, and thank you to Britta for that question. We have another question here from Lawrence. So, does the method currently use largely open source data? And if so, when it comes to sharing of commercially sensitive data, is there natural ways of protecting the IP in terms of data and knowledge while still sharing the information? And will the methods of differential privacy, etc., be essential?
Okay, well, this is a very good question. I mean, like, as I'm funded by taxpayer money, mainly, except for some of the company work, everything I do is supposed to be in the public domain, and there's a nice Git repository and so on. We do make data that is in the public domain publicly accessible. So you basically can, for example, you can go and copy our whole triple store for chemical species, no problem. Okay, that's publicly available. But the beauty about the word avatar, of course, is that it doesn't have to be public available. So far, the T boxes, I mean, like the ontology itself, the sort of data models and the knowledge models, they are also publicly available. But the instances, the data itself, they are not. And they can, a classic example, the Guido project, we actually work with real data from the infrastructure provider, and this is super sensitive. So that was locked away, and we had to basically push our technology into the secure storage. We even didn't see the data as such because it was so security critical. And of course, if you run a lab, it is clear that you don't want everyone to be able to modify the building management system and change the set point of your system and pull it down to whatever. Yeah. Okay.
Cool. Thank you for your answer, and thank you to Lawrence for the question. Lawrence also says thank you. And then I have one more question that I might probe you for just before we finish, which is again to do with the ontologies. But did any of the ontologies or the network shapes, when you were designing them, ever sort of look familiar to some of the chemical and chemistry shapes you saw in your early?
No. That's a real. I mean, that's good. This is a good question, and or at least a comment. They actually differ quite a bit. Okay, and you can, especially for chemistry, can have extremely sparse structures. And these sparse structures, so in the earlier days of the question answering, we tried knowledge graph embedding. And the structure of your ontology has a massive influence on how well you can do the embedding. And so, yeah, these structures look very, very different depending on, can look very different depending on the domain, but I cannot make a more general statement about this. But I believe that this is a very important area in future.
Cool, great, thank you. So thank you to Professor Markus Kraft once again, and thank you to the audience for attending and for the questions. I hope everyone has enjoyed and found this also a useful talk, and can maybe inspire some continuing work of their own, or some questions, or to read some of Professor Markus's group's work or something like that. So again, thank you to Markus for your time and for taking part. There are going to be more webinars of this series, certainly for sure. So do look out for the next announcement coming very soon. And just check out the information either on the DC Cambridge, either our LinkedIn or our Twitter. And again, so yeah, thank you very much all for attending, and thank you again to Professor Markus Kraft.
Thank you.